The perfect neighborhood had a perfect problem. Barbara Henderson stood behind her pristine white curtains at 6:47 m, watching the house across the street with a kind of... For 8 months, the Henderson family had ruled Rosewood Heights with iron-fisted precision. Barbara, the self-appointed queen of this gated community, adorned HOA. "Frank, get over here now," Barbara hissed into her phone, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The HOA security guard would be at her door in minutes, ready to execute whatever. But what Barbara didn't know about her quiet neighbor would soon turn her perfect world upside down. Dr. Carmen Valdez had been keeping a secret that would shatter every... Comment below if you think Barbara deserves what's coming next. Carmen Valdez had perfected the art of invisibility over the past 2 years in Rosewood Heights. At 36, her neighbors knew almost nothing about her beyond the basics. Single mother, worked irregular hours, drove a modest Honda Civic that looked out of place among the luxury. What they didn't know could fill volumes. The exhaustion that lined her face wasn't from partying or laziness, but from 12-hour surgical shifts. At Street, Mary's medical center, and her son Luke, whom the neighbors occasionally glimpsed, playing in their backyard, wasn't just shy or antisocial. He was a brilliant 9-year-old navigating life on the autism. Carmen had learned early in her medical career that anonymity was a blessing. Famous surgeons attracted attention, and attention attracted problems. So she had chosen this life deliberately. Quiet mornings with Luke before her night shifts, careful interactions with neighbors who saw her as just another working mother, and at least that had been the plan before Barbara Henderson moved in across the street. The first complaint had come within a week of the Hendersons' arrival. Carmen remembered. "I'm Barbara Henderson, HOA President," she had announced without preamble. "We need to discuss your son's noise levels. This is a family-friendly community, but we maintain." Carmen had tried to explain without revealing too much. "He's just playing. Senora and Henderson boys will be boys." Right, but Barbara's expression had made it clear that the complaints had escalated from there. Luke's collection of musical instruments, carefully chosen by his occupational therapist to help with sensory integration, each complaint came with increasingly aggressive demands, specific quiet hours that conflicted with Luke's therapeutic routines, threats of fines that could bankrupt a single. Carmen had endured all in silence, deflecting Barbara's attacks while protecting Luke from the growing hostility. She couldn't risk revealing her professional status but this morning felt different standing in Air Kitchen at las 6:45 am, preparing Luke's carefully structured breakfast. Before her night shift, Carmen noticed Barbara's silhouette. "Mom, why does the mean lady stare at our house?" Luke asked, his voice carrying the precise diction that marked many children on the spectrum. He stood at their kitchen. Carmen's heart clenched. Luke's ability to read social situations was remarkable, even if his responses to them were sometimes unconventional. If he was noticing Barbara, "Some people are just curious, honey," Carmen replied, keeping her voice light while her mind raced through possibilities. She had hoped to keep Luke sheltered from the doorbell rang at exactly 7 a.m., its sharp chime cutting through the morning quiet like an alarm. Carmen checked the security camera and felt her stomach drop. Luke immediately began his stress response, a gentle, rockin' motion that helped Chaim cope with unexpected changes to his routine. Carmen knelt beside him, her hands steady. As Luke retreated upstairs, Carmen took a deep breath and opened the door. Barbara's smile was sharp as a scalpel, her clipboard ready for battle. "Dr. Valdez," she began, "and I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your situation here in Rosewood Heights, about whether a doctor who clearly can't control her own child's behavioral..." The words hung in the morning air like poison gas. Carmen realized that this wasn't just about noise complaints anymore. This was about power, control, and But what Barbara didn't understand was exactly what kind of doctor she was threatening, or how desperately her expertise would be needed in just a few short hours. Frank Morrison, MAM. We've received multiple complaints about noise violations emanating from this residence as HOA enforcement. Officer, I'm required to document these incidents for. Carmen's medical training kicked in. The same calm focus that guided her through complex surgeries now helped her navigate these domestic crises. What specific violations are? Barbara consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision. Yesterday at 3:47 p.m., excessive drumming. Tuesday at 4:15 p.m., unauthorized outdoor vocalizations. Monday morning at each violation was Luke's therapeutic routine, carefully prescribed by his medical team and essential for his development. Carmen felt fury building in her chest. Those activities occurred during permitted hours and fall within normal residential use, Carmen replied, her surgeon's precision evident in every word. Unless you can. Barbara's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flash of anger that crossed her features. She wasn't accustomed to resistance from her targets, especially not articulated with. The third security guard finally spoke, his voice rougher than Frank's polished authority. We're prepared to involve Child Protective Services, if necessary. Kids' behavior. Carmen's composure cracked for just a moment, a fleeting expression of protective rage that any parent would recognize. The threat to involve CPS was the nuclear option. You're threatening to weaponize child services against a child whose only crime is existing differently than your narrow expectations. Carmen's voice dropped to the. Barbara stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that wouldn't carry to potential witnesses. This community has standards, doctor. Your son doesn't meet them, and neither. The ultimatum crystallized everything Carmen had feared about moving to Rosewood Heights. The beautiful houses and manicured lawns concealed hearts as barren as winter fields. The easy way involves you accepting our help in finding appropriate residential placement for children with special needs, Barbara continued, her words carefully chosen. Carmen's phone buzzed with an incoming message, but she ignored it. Every fiber of her being was focused on this moment. This threat to her son's safety and their right to. Mr. Henderson, Carmen said, her voice carrying the authority she wielded in operating rooms where life and death decisions happen in seconds. You have 5 seconds. Barbara's laugh was sharp and bitter. Call them. I am the police. In this neighborhood. Drive. Valdez, I decide what's acceptable and what isn't, and you and your problem child are not acceptable. The confrontation was reaching a crescendo that would normally have climaxed in slammed doors and shouted threats, but Carmen's phone chose that moment to ring with it. St. Mary's Medical Center flashed on her caller ID, and her heart sank. Emergency calls during her off hours usually meant one thing, a cardiac crisis that required her. Dr. Valdez. The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's chief of staff. We need you here. Immediately, a multi-vehicle accident. Multiple cardiac. Carmen closed her eyes briefly, her mind shifting gears from domestic crisis to medical emergency. Lives were more important than neighborhood politics. Aben went to see. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she replied, already, mentally, preparing for surgery. As she ended the call, Barbara's voice cut through her focus like an unwelcome intrusion. Running away from your responsibilities again. Doctor, conversation isn't finished. We'll be waiting when you get back, and next time we'll have official documentation. Carmen looked directly at Barbara, her expression shifting to the controlled intensity that had earned her a reputation as one of the most formidable surgeons in the region. She turned toward her house, then paused. And when I return, if I find you've caused my son any distress while I was saving lives, You'll discover exactly how protective it. But as Carmen rushed inside to arrange emergency childcare and prepare for surgery, none of them could have predicted that, within hours, Barbara Henderson herself would be. Luke appeared at the top of the stairs, his noise-canceling headphones around his neck, his face showing the careful blankness that meant he was processing overwhelming emotions. "Mom, are we in trouble?" Carmen's heart broke a little more. Her brilliant, sensitive son shouldn't have to worry about adult cruelties, shouldn't have to fear that being different made him unwelcome in the world. Nitrogen monoxide. Baby, we're not in trouble. Sometimes adults disagree about things, but that's not your fault, and it's not your responsibility to fix, Seg nailed beside him. Air hands. Luke nodded solemnly, his understanding of the world filtered through patterns and routines that made sense to him. Will the mean lady go away while you're gone? Te. Carmen wanted to promise him safety, wanted to guarantee that Barbara's threats would evaporate like morning mist. But her son deserved honesty, even when the truth was complicated. I don't know, Luke, but I know that you're safe, that you're loved, and that nobody has the right to make you feel bad for being exactly who you are. She hugged him tightly. Grace Park arrived within minutes, her kind face creaked with concern as Carmen quickly explained the situation. As a small business owner who dealt with difficult customers, "Don't worry about Luke," Grace said, her voice warm with genuine affection for the boy who often helped her arrange flowers with mathematical precision. "We'll work on that." Carmen smiled despite her stress. Grace's fierce loyalty and complete acceptance of Luke's differences had made her one of the few genuine friends they had in Rosewood Heights. As Carmen drove toward the hospital, her mind divided between the surgical challenges ahead and the domestic crisis she was leaving behind. She couldn't shake the St. Mary's Medical Center erupted in controlled chaos as Carmen pushed through the emergency department doors. The familiar scent of antiseptic and the urgent voices of Dr. Valdez, "Thank God you're here," called Dr. Patricia Williams, her white coat stained with evidence of the crisis unfolding. 3-car collision on Interstate 85. 2. Carmen's mind immediately organized the information, prioritizing based on survival odds and surgical complexity. This was her element, the place where years of training and "What's the ETA on the first patient?" she asked, already mentally preparing for the complex procedures ahead. Her hands moved automatically to tie back her hair and check. "They're bringing him in now. 23-year-old male, penetrating trauma to the chest, possible damage to the left anterior descending artery. Paramedics have him stabilized." Carmen nodded, her focus narrowing to laser intensity. Personal problems had no place in the operating room. When she held a scalpel, nothing existed except the patient. But miles away in Rosewood Heights, Barbara Henderson was about to learn that the universe has its own sense of timing. And sometimes the people we try to destroy are the... Barbara stood in her pristine kitchen, her hands shaking with rage as she stared across the street at Carmen's now empty house. The confrontation hadn't gone according to Frank. "I want round-the-clock surveillance on that house." She barked into her phone, her voice sharp with frustration. "Document everything, every visitor, every sound, every..." Frank Morrison's voice crackled through the speaker with obedient enthusiasm. "Yes, ma'am." "What about the kid? Want me to follow up on those CPS contacts?" The suggestion. "Absolutely." Anonymous tips about noise disturbances, possible neglect, inappropriate supervision make it sound concerned rather than vindictive. Barbara's strategic mind. As she hung up the phone, Barbara felt the familiar rush of power that came from orchestrating other people's downfall. She had built her reputation on maintaining property values. The afternoon sun slanted through her kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny worlds, oblivious to the human dramas unfolding below. But as her fingers flew across the keyboard, detailing invented noise violations and fabricated property infractions. Barbara felt an odd flutter in her chest. The flutter became a squeeze, then a pressure that made her pause mid-sentence. She rubbed her chest absently, attributing the discomfort to too much coffee and too little. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Carmen was elbow deep in the most complex cardiac surgery of her career. The young man's chest cavity told a story of devastating trauma. Torn pressures dropping again, announced her surgical nurse, monitoring the patient's vitals with practiced efficiency. He's losing too much blood. We need to find the source of the bleeding. Carmen's hands moved with surgical precision, each cut and suture guided by years of training and an intuitive understanding of cardiac anatomy. There, see, that small. In the sterile environment of Operating Room 3, time moved differently. Minutes stretched into hours as Carmen worked to repair damage that would have been fatal just decades. Back in Rosewood Heights, Barbara's discomfort was becoming harder to ignore. The pressure in her chest had intensified into something that felt like a tight band wrapped around. Instead, the movement triggered a wave of nausea so intense that she had to grip the kitchen counter to keep from falling. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the air. Just stress, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the empty kitchen. Just the excitement of finally dealing with that problem, neighbor bot Ebenezer. The next wave of pain was impossible to dismiss. It radiated from her chest down her left arm with the intensity that made her cry out involuntarily. Her carefully applied makeup. Barbara fumbled for her phone, her fingers suddenly clumsy and unresponsive. The device slipped from her grasp and clattered to the kitchen floor, its screen cracking against. As she bent to retrieve the phone, another wave of pain hit her with the force of a sledgehammer. This time, there was no denying what was happening. The symptoms she had been, "Oh, God," she gasped, finally admitting to herself what her body had been trying to tell her for the past hour. "Oh, God, I'm having a heart attack." The words seemed impossible. With shaking hands, she managed to dial 911, her voice cracking as she tried to explain her symptoms to the dispatcher. I think I'm having a heart attack." The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, trained to guide panicked callers through medical emergencies. "Ma'am, I'm sending an ambulance to your location immediately." Barbara looked around her empty kitchen, suddenly aware of how isolated she had made herself in her quest for perfect control. Her husband was traveling for work. Her adult, "I'm alone," she whispered, the words carrying a weight of meaning that extended far beyond her immediate physical location. For the first time in years, Barbara Henderson was. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, its flashing lights painting the perfect lawns of Rosewood Heights in alternating patterns of red and blue. Paramedics rushed into. "Ma'am, we're taking you to St. Mary's Medical Center," the lead paramedic explained as they loaded her onto the stretcher. "They have the best cardiac unit in the region." St. Mary's Medical Center, the same hospital where Carmen Valdez was just finishing the most challenging surgery of her day. The same Dr. Carmen Valdez, whom Barbara had. As the ambulance raced through traffic, Barbara's mind drifted between consciousness and confusion. The medications the paramedics had administered created a hazy dreamlike. She found herself thinking about Luke, the autistic boy she had tormented with such systematic cruelty. In her altered state, she could see him clearly, not as the neighborhood. The ambulance bay at St. Mary's erupted in controlled activity as Barbara's stretcher was rushed through automatic doors. Emergency room staff moved with practiced efficiency. Massive probable la declusion, called out the attending emergency physician, using medical shorthand to communicate that Barbara was experiencing a major heart. "We need cardiac surgery. Stat. Who's available?" The question hung in the air for a moment as nurses checked the surgical schedule. Then Dr. Williams appeared, Her face? Dr. Valdez just finished a complex procedure, but she's the only cardiac surgeon currently in the hospital who can handle this level of emergency. The other surgeons are in operating room 3. Carmen was closing the chest of her previous patient, satisfied that she had successfully repaired the damage from the car accident. Her young patient. Her pager buzzed with an emergency code, and she looked up from her sutures with the resigned expression of someone who knew that her day was far from over. Dr. Williams, 2 or 3. Carmen finished her final sutures and stepped back from the table, allowing her surgical team to complete the closure while she prepared for whatever new crisis awaited. This was. As she scrubbed out of her completed surgery, Dr. Williams appeared in the hallway with an expression that Carmen had learned to read over years of working together. This wasn't it. Carmen, we need to talk before you see the next patient. Dr. Williams' voice carried unusual tension, the kind that meant personal complications were about to intersect with. Carmen felt the world shift slightly around her, as if someone had tilted the entire hospital a few degrees off its axis. Of all the cardiac emergencies that could have arrived, Barbara Henderson, the woman from my neighborhood. Carmen's voice remained steady, but her mind was racing through the ethical implications of the situation. Cooled. Say, the same one. She's in critical condition. Massive heart attack with significant damage to the lad. Without immediate surgical intervention, she won't survive the night. Dr. Carmen closed her eyes briefly, calling upon the ethical training that had been drummed into her throughout medical school and residency. The Hippocratic oath was clear. Prep, ordos, she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made an impossible decision and would stand by it regardless of personal cost. Unpage. My operating room 2 at St. Mary's Medical Center had seen countless life-and-death struggles, but tonight's surgery carried an emotional weight that pressed down on everyone. The woman who had threatened her son just hours earlier now lay completely vulnerable, her life dependent on the very skills she had mocked and dismissed. Barbara's chest rose. EKG shows continued street elevation in leads 2, 3, and a V, reported the surgical nurse, her voice cutting through Carmen's internal struggle. Blood pressure is 80 over 40. Carmen's training took over, pushing personal considerations aside with the ruthless efficiency that had made her one of the region's most respected cardiac surgeons. Barbara, beginning coronary bypass procedure, Carmen announced to her team, her voice carrying the calm authority that had guided her through hundreds of similar operations. As Carmen made her initial incision, her mind couldn't help but drift to the cruel irony of the situation. This morning, Barbara had questioned her qualifications as both a doctor 3 floors down in the hospital's family waiting area. An unexpected drama was unfolding. Frank Morrison sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his HOA security uniform. But Frank was grappling with something more complex than concern for his boss. The events of the morning had taken on a different significance now that Barbara lay fighting for Mr. Morrison. A gentle voice interrupted his troubled thoughts. Grace Park stood beside his chair, her face showing the genuine concern that had made her beloved among. Frank looked up at Grace with eyes that reflected shame and confusion. They said she needs surgery. Major heart attack. Dr. Williams wouldn't give me details because I'm not. Grace sat down beside him, her expression thoughtful. She had witnessed the morning's confrontation from her garden, had seen the cruelty directed at Carmen and Luke. What do you mean, Frank? The doctor. Dr. Valdez. She's here. She's the one operating on Barbara right now. Frank's words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. We threatened her. Grace felt a chill run down her spine as the full irony of the situation became clear. Carmen is Barbara's surgeon, the same Carmen who Barbara was terrorizing this morning. Meanwhile, back in OR2, Carmen was discovering the full extent of Barbara's cardiac damage. The heart attack had been massive, affecting multiple areas of the heart muscle. The left anterior descending is completely blocked, she reported to her team, her voice steady despite the challenge. Before her, we're looking at a triple bypass minimum, Dr. Patricia Williams observed from the gallery above the operating room, her experienced eye recognizing the complexity of what Carmen was attempting. This wasn't just Jesus, whispered one of the surgical residents. Look at that damage. How is she even still alive? The question reflected what everyone in the room was thinking. Barbara, Carmen's hands moved with practiced precision, each cut and suture guided by years of training and an intuitive understanding of cardiac anatomy that bordered on the first graft is in place, she announced, her voice carrying satisfaction at a job well done. Blood flow is improving too. The anterior wall. Let's check the posterior descending. As Carmen worked, her mind couldn't help but wondered what Luke was doing at that moment. Grace had promised to keep him safe, but the morning's confrontation had shaken his. Back in Rosewood Heights, Luke was indeed struggling with the day's events. He sat in Grace's living room, his noise-canceling headphones on, working on a complex Lego. Luke, sweetie, are you okay? Grace asked gently, respecting his need for space while making sure he knew she was available if he needed support. Luke's response was, Mrs. Henderson was very angry at Mom, he said finally, his precise diction carrying none of the emotional turmoil that Grace could see in his posture. When people are angry, bad. Grace felt her heart break a little at the question. This brilliant 9-year-old had processed the morning's confrontation with the clarity that often characterized. Your mum is very safe, Grace assured him. She's one of the best doctors in the whole city. She helps people get better when they're hurt. She paused, choosing her words. Luke's hands paused in their Lego construction as he processed this information. His understanding of the world was often more sophisticated than adults expected. Filtered, Mom saves people because that's what doctors do, he said, with the matter-of-fact delivery that characterized many of his observations. Even mean people need saving sometimes. Baequinordos Carmen was facing the most challenging aspect of Barbara's surgery. The damage to the posterior wall of the heart was more extensive than the initial scans had. The posterior descending artery is worse than we thought, she reported to her team. We're going to need to get creative with this graft. The attachment points are. This was where Carmen's reputation as a surgical artist became evident. Lesser surgeons might have settled for partial repairs, accepting that some heart function would be. Dr. Valdez ventured one of her surgical residents. Are you sure that approach will work? I've never seen a graft placed at that angle before. The question reflected both. Carmen paused in her work, looking up at her team with the patience of a master craftsperson, explaining their art too. Aprendices. Sometimes the textbook approach isn't enough. The philosophy behind her words extended far beyond surgical technique. Carmen had built her entire life around the principle that healing required seeing beyond surface. As she worked on the most delicate aspect of bypass surgery, Carmen found herself thinking about the morning's confrontation from a different perspective. Fear makes people do terrible things, Carmen murmured to herself, her words barely audible over the sounds of the operating room. But fear doesn't have to be permanent. The surgical resident assisting her caught the words and looked up with curiosity. Dr. Valdez, did you say something about fear? The question reminded Carmen that even in the just thinking out loud, Carmen replied, refocusing on the intricate sutures that would determine whether Barbara's heart could pump effectively enough to sustain life. Outside in the hospital corridor, an unexpected visitor had arrived. Tom Henderson, Barbara's husband, rushed through the automatic doors with the frantic energy of someone who, where is she? Where's my wife? Tom's voice carried the panic of someone whose ordered world had suddenly collapsed. The hospital staff moved quickly to direct him to the Tom. Frank stood up as Barbara's husband approached, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God you made it. The doctors said it was touch and go, but she's in surgery now." Tom's face was pale with exhaustion and fear, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from hours of desperate travel. Dr. Valdez. That name sounds familiar. Isn't that? The question hung in the air like a physical presence, forcing Frank and Grace to confront the ethical complexity of the situation that was unfolding. Tom had no idea. Grace looked at Frank with an expression that clearly communicated the need for careful truth-telling. "Tom, there were some disagreements this morning. Neighborhood." Tom's businessman mind immediately began processing the implications of what he was hearing. Barbara's tendency toward neighborhood conflicts was something he had learned. What kind of disagreements? Tom's voice carried the controlled tone of someone who suspected there was more to the story than he was being told. "Frank, my wife is—" Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his security uniform suddenly feeling like a costume from a play he longer wanted to be performing in. "We went to talk to Dr. He did how?" Tom's question carried the persistence of someone who had built a successful business by understanding the complete picture before making decisions. "Frank, my—" Grace intervened before Frank's obvious discomfort could make the situation worse. "Tom, your wife was very stressed about neighborhood issues." Dr. Valdez remained professional, but Tom's mind was working through the ethical implications with the same analytical precision he applied to business problems. The irony was almost too perfect to be. Baikinordos Carmen was putting the finishing touches on what would be remembered as one of the most complex cardiac surgeries ever performed at St. Mary's Medical Center. "For final graft is in place," she announced to her team, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a job well done against overwhelming odds. "Blood flow is restored to all major." The moment of truth in any cardiac surgery came when the artificial support systems were gradually reduced. Testing whether the patient's heart could function independently. "Heart rate is stabilizing at 72 beats per minute," reported the surgical nurse, her voice carrying relief that everyone in the room shared. "Blood pressure is climbing. She's—" Carmen stepped back from the operating table, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Barbara Henderson would live. "The woman." "Outstanding work, Dr. Valdez," said Dr. Williams over the intercom. From the observation gallery, that was surgical artistry of the highest order. "Barbara Henderson owes her life to your abilities." As Carmen began the process of closing Barbara's chest, she found herself thinking about Luke's earlier words. "Even mean people need saving sometimes." Her 9-year-old son. The surgery had taken nearly 6 hours, pushing physical endurance to its limits. But as she placed the final sutures, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from "Patient is stable for transfer to cardiac ICU," she announced to her Tim. "Monitor closely for the next 24 hours. But the prognosis is exigent. Full recovery expected within 6 to 8 weeks. As Barbara was wheeled toward the intensive care unit, Carmen finally allowed herself to consider the personal implications of what she had done. Tomorrow, Barbara would. But what would happen when Barbara recovered enough to understand the full irony of her situation? Would gratitude overcome prejudice? Could this experience change a heart? In 3 days after Barbara Henderson's life-saving surgery, the cardiac intensive care unit at St. Mary's Medical Center had settled into the quiet rhythm of recovery. Barbara, when lucidity finally returned on the 4th morning, her first coherent words were a whispered question that would have surprised anyone who knew her reputation in Rosewood. Tom Henderson sat beside her bed, his hand gently holding hers, relief evident in every line of his face. For 3 days he had watched monitors and listened to medical. "Dr. Carmen Valdez," he said quietly, watching Barbara's face for any sign of recognition. "She's apparently one of the best cardiac surgeons in the region. The other doctors." Barbara's eyes widened with something that might have been shock, or perhaps the beginning of a deeper understanding. The name connected immediately to memories that seemed to— "Carmen Valdez," she repeated, her voice barely audible above the quiet hum of medical equipment. "The neighbor, with the autistic son." The words came slowly, as if she— Tom's expression grew serious, reflecting conversations he'd had with Frank Morrison and other neighbors while Barbara fought for her life. "Barbara, we need to talk about what?" Barbara closed her eyes, not from physical pain, but from the emotional weight of memories that suddenly seemed unbearably heavy. The woman she had threatened and harassed had spent— "I remember," she whispered, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "I remember everything I said to her. The threats about her son, about calling CPS, about driving them." Tom squeezed her hand gently, his businessman's mind still struggling to process the ethical complexity of the doctors said she never hesitated. Never. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Patricia Williams entered with her usual professional composure, but her expression carried something more. Barbara struggled to sit up slightly, her body still weak from the trauma of surgery. "Doctor, I need to ask you something. Dr. Valdez, why did she agree to operate on me? She must have known who I was." Dr. Williams studied Barbara's face carefully, recognizing the deeper questions behind the medical inquiry. "Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Valdez is one of the most ethical physicians." The simple statement carried profound implications that Barbara was only beginning to understand. No discussion of personal conflicts. No consideration of their neighborhood. "But surely she must have— quotes. Barbara began, then stopped herself. What had she expected? That Carmen would abandon medical ethics for personal satisfaction. That a doctor who— Dr. Williams sat down in the visitor's chair, her demeanor shifting from purely medical to something more personal. "Señora Henderson, I've known Carmen Valdez for 8 years. She paused, letting the implications of those examples settle into Barbara's consciousness. "She has never, not once, let personal feelings interfere with her medical—" Barbara felt something breaking inside her chest. Not the physical damage from the heart attack, but something deeper and more fundamental. The worldview that had shaped her. "I tried to destroy her," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of full confession. "I threatened her son, tried to drive them from their home, called her competence into—" Tom watched his wife's face transform as she spoke, seeing emotions he hadn't witnessed in their years of marriage. The rigid control that had defined Barbara's personality was— Dr. Williams stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Mrs. Henderson, you have several weeks of recovery ahead of you. I suggest you use that time to consider what kind of person—" After the doctor left, Barbara and Tom sat in silence for several minutes. The ICU's quiet bustle continued around them, nurses checking monitors, families visiting other. "What kind of person tries to hurt a child because they're different?" Barbara asked finally, the question directed more at herself than at Tom. "What was wrong with me that I—" Tom had been asking himself similar questions during the long hours of Barbara's unconsciousness. His wife's obsession with neighborhood perfection had escalated over— "I think we both lost sight of what really matters," he said, quietly. "We got so focused on maintaining appearances that we forgot about basic human kindness." The admission was— Meanwhile, 6 floors down in the hospital's family conference room, Carmen was meeting with Luke's behavioral specialist to discuss how the recent stress had affected his— "He's been asking a lot of questions about why people are mean to each other," Dr. Martinez reported, her voice carrying the gentle concern that made her so effective with— Carmen nodded, recognizing the challenge that harassment had created for her son. Luke's mind worked. differently than neurotypical children, seeking patterns and, "What have you told him?" Carmen asked, trusting Dr. Martinez's expertise in navigating complex social concepts with children who processed information through different cognitive frameworks. "We've talked about how fear can make people act in ways that hurt others, even when those actions don't make logical sense," Dr. Martinez explained. "Luke understands fear." Carmen felt a familiar surge of protective love for her brilliant, sensitive son. Luke's understanding of human nature was often more profound than that of adults who had. He also asked if you were going to help Mrs. Henderson get better, Dr. Martinez continued. "When I explained that you had performed surgery to save her life, Esidit made the simple wisdom of a 9-year-old had captured the essence of medical ethics in ways that years of philosophy and debate sometimes missed. Doctors helped people get back in the ICU. Barbara was receiving an unexpected visitor. Frank Morrison stood outside her room, his security uniform replaced by civilian clothes. His usual, "Barbara, I don't know what to say," Frank began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had participated in cruelty and was now confronting its consequences. Ven. Barbara gestured for him to sit down, noting how different he looked without the authority symbols that had defined their relationship. "Frank, we were bullies." No. Frank nodded miserably, his hands fidgeting with the baseball cap he held in his lap. "I keep thinking about that Kit's face when we were standing on their porch. Wash. We caused a lot of damage," Barbara agreed, her voice growing stronger as she faced the full scope of their actions. "But maybe we can start trying to repair some of—" The conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. Grace Park entered with a large bouquet of flowers. From Ayersop, her face showing the complex mix of emotions. "Grace," Barbara said, attempting to sit up straighter. "You didn't have to come. I know. I haven't been kind to many people in our community." The understatement hung in. Grace set the flowers on the bedside table and took the remaining chair. "Barbara, I came because I wanted to tell you about something," Luke said when he heard you were in the hospital. Barbara braced herself for whatever innocent wisdom was about to be delivered by the child she had tried so hard to silence. Children on the autism spectrum often had a way of— "He asked if you were scared," Grace continued. "When I said that people usually are scared when they're sick," he said, "that maybe that's why you were mean before, because you—" The observation hit Barbara with the force of a revelation. A 9-year-old boy had diagnosed the root of her cruelty, with more accuracy than she had managed in years of self. "He's right," Barbara whispered, tears flowing freely now. "I was scared. Scared of anything that didn't fit my idea of how the neighborhood should be. Scared that if I led one—" Grace reached over and gently squeezed Barbara's hand. "Luke also said that maybe now you wouldn't be scared anymore, because you know his mom takes good care of people when they're hurt." The wisdom of a child who had been the target of harassment was offering forgiveness before it had even been requested, the magnitude of grace being extended by the family she had. Later that evening, as visiting hours ended, Barbara lay alone with her thoughts and the steady beeping of monitors that marked her return to life. Tomorrow, she would begin. She thought about Luke's analysis of her behavior, about Carmen's unwavering professionalism, about the community she had tried to shape through fear and control. The woman who— "Maybe it's not too late," she whispered to the empty room. "Maybe can still learn to be the kind of person who deserves to live in a neighborhood with people like the Valdez family." 6 months later, Rosewood Heights had become a different kind of community. The changes started small. Barbara Henderson's resignation as HOA President, new policies. Barbara stood in her front yard, watching Luke play in his backyard with equipment that had once been the source of noise complaints. His therapeutic routines now seemed like— Carmen appeared at her back door, checking on Luke, as she did every day before her shift at the hospital. Their eyes met across the distance between their yards, and Barbara. The morning sun illuminated both houses equally, casting no shadows of judgment or condemnation. In the distance, Luke's laughter mixed with the sounds of other children playing. "Mom," Luke called out, his voice carrying the excitement that marked his happiest moments. Mrs. Henderson waved at us. "Maybe she's not scared anymore." Carmen smiled as she waved back at Barbara, thinking about how much had changed since that terrible morning when threats and cruelty had nearly destroyed their peace. Barbara walked across the street, a journey she had taken in anger so many months before, but now traveled with humility and hope. "Dr. Valdez," she called out, her voice. "Please, call me Carmen," came the reply, spoken with the same professionalism that had characterized her demeanor even during their worst confrontations. "How are you feeling, Barbara? You look well." "I feel like a different person," Barbara said, and meant it completely. "Carmen, I've been wanting to ask you, why did you save my life after everything I put you and Luke through?" Carmen's answer came without hesitation, reflecting the medical ethics that had guided her entire career. "Because healing people is what doctors do, Barbara. It's not." Luke appeared beside his mother, his direct gaze settling on Barbara with the clear assessment that characterized many of his social interactions. "Señora Henderson, are you still?" Barbara knelt down to Luke's eye level, her voice gentle but clear. "No, Luke. I'm not scared anymore. I'm sorry I was mean to you before. You're exactly the kind of neighbor I want to have."